Welcome and thank you for viewing Groton's virtual listening session. This video gives an overview of the progress to date for the town's Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness and Hazard Mitigation Planning Project. My name is Adria Boynton and I'm a Resiliency Specialist at Weston & Sampson, which is a certified MVP vendor. This virtual format is actually composed of two parts: the webinar, which you're viewing now, and an online survey that you can use to share your feedback with us. That survey will be available until April 23rd, and a link is included at the end of this video. We will incorporate your comments into our final project report. Here's an outline of this video. This project was funded by an MVP grant, so I'm going to explain what that means, and I'm going to give an overview of the MVP and HMP programs. I'm going to talk about climate change in Massachusetts and in Groton more locally. I'm going to talk about the strengths, vulnerabilities, and priority action items that were identified during the workshop. And I'm going to talk about what happens next in this process, namely that we want to hear from you through the online survey. We'll start with an overview of the MVP and HMP programs. MVP is a state program that stands for Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness, and HMP is a federal program that stands for Hazard Mitigation Planning. These are some of the leading principles of the MVP program. It really looks to employ local knowledge and utilize that expertise. Even though this is a statewide program, it should feel personal and unique to Groton. It utilizes partnerships that are pre-existing in the community and leverages those existing efforts to build the resilience of the town and make the town stronger than it is today. We use the best available climate projections and data, and the state is doing a lot to advance these efforts. If you're interested, Resilient MA is a great place to look for more information beyond this presentation. The MVP program really prioritizes nature-based solutions. For example, wetlands can provide flood storage. So protecting existing wetlands or restoring wetlands that have perhaps been damaged through previous development could be proactive, resilient strategies. Another important part of this process is thinking about our most vulnerable residents and how climate change will impact different people in our community differently. How can we make sure that everyone is prepared? The MVP process has two different phases. The first phase is the planning grant phase, shown in red, which is where Groton is now. The second phase is the MVP action grant, shown in green. The MVP planning grant involves developing a list of priority action items, which are essentially potential projects that are eligible for funding through the MVP action grant, which is providing up to $2 million in funding for each project and up to $10 million in total available funding. Here are some examples of projects that are eligible for that MVP action grant. You'll notice that community outreach and education is a big component of our planning process, but it's also a big part of action grant projects moving forward. There's also a big focus on nature-based solutions, and there are some new categories shown in green, including energy resilience, land acquisition, and partnering with low-income housing and mosquito control districts. In Groton, we leveraged the MVP process to also update your Hazard Mitigation Plan, or HMP, which is usually updated every 5 years. This slide shows why we chose that path, because there is a lot of great overlap, shown in green, between the two programs, which allows us to combine the processes. That overlap includes things like regional collaboration, community engagement, reviewing data, and identifying action items. We also conducted a series of interviews with local experts to talk about climate adaptation related to fields like emergency management in Groton, planning, public utilities, schools, conservation, and more. The findings from all of that work will be synthesized into a joint MVP and HMP report, which will make Groton eligible for both the state MVP action grants that I just talked about, as well as federal grants through FEMA, which is the Federal Emergency Management Agency. To give you a sense of the overall, here's what our project timeline has looked like. A key part of this planning process is the Community Resilience Building Workshop, or CRB. We convened close to 30 people for an all-day workshop, which included town staff, local organizations, state staff, and other stakeholders. This webinar is the virtual version of the listening session. We're currently working on finalizing the MVP-HMP plan, and we will be working towards applying for an action grant, which is that second phase that we talked about. During the CRB workshop, we focused on 4 hazards, identified what are the vulnerabilities to these hazards, what are our strengths that we can leverage in preparing for these hazards, and we identified priority action items across 3 different categories: infrastructure, society, and the environment. So let's talk about those climate hazards. The 4 hazards selected at this workshop as being most important and relevant to Groton included extreme temperatures, extreme weather, like nor'easters, wind, and snow, fires and drought, and flooding. The next slides will show historic data and future climate change projections related to each of these hazards. We know that temperatures have been increasing. We've already seen about 1/2 degree per decade of warming since 1970, and we've seen a particular increase in warming during the winter season. Moving into the future, in Massachusetts, we'll start to experience more days over 90 degrees. So by the end of the century, we might have as many as 35 of those really hot days, days that we would consider a heat wave if they occur consecutively. That's about a month's worth of time. Currently, we're only seeing about 6 of those days. We'll also see less days below 32 degrees, or days when we'll get snow or have those freezing temperatures. Right now, we have about 145 of those days annually, but it could go down to as little as 101 days by the end of the century. Again, a change of roughly a month. Drought is a related concern. The most recent notable drought was in 2016, but the occurrence of droughts lasting up to 3 months could increase by as much as 75% by 2100. These conditions could have a direct impact on drinking water supply and on the fire department. Brush fire is a concern in Groton, and the level of risk is illustrated by the wildfire hazard map shown on the left. Many fires are caused by human error, and Groton has had a history of brush fires, but the town has also invested in mitigation projects for areas at the highest degree of risk, including the Lost Lake neighborhood. As we've seen, temperature increase has a variety of impacts, including increased drought and wildfires. The increase in vector-borne diseases due to mosquitoes and ticks also pose a public health challenge. Heat waves are another public health concern and can lead to heat-related illnesses and increased demand on energy systems. These conditions can disproportionately impact vulnerable residents, and it will be important to make sure that there are cooling centers that residents can access when they need to. Moving into the extreme precipitation and flooding section, again we've seen increases in precipitation already, including a more than 70% increase in precipitation during extreme events in the Northeast since 1958. And this increase in the intensity of rain events does impact us locally, including in parts of town that might flood more frequently or more severely than they used to. Looking forward, we're likely to see these trends continue. We're anticipating an 8% increase in extreme precipitation events by 2050, and a 13% increase by the end of the century. There are a few areas in town where flooding is currently experienced, and this flooding could worsen with climate change. Flooding related to stormwater could be caused by poor drainage, a high amount of impervious surfaces, and by undersized culverts. Historically, we've been designing our culverts based on past data for rain events. Moving forward, we want to think about what the design storms will look like in the future when we factor in climate change. Beyond flooding, changing precipitation can have other impacts, like increased road pollutants in water bodies, damage from intense rainfall, and stressed ecosystems. Severe winter weather can be costly and disruptive. Power outages are a top concern. We've also seen an upward trend in nor'easters. I've listed a few notable recent events here, particularly the 3 nor'easters that we experienced almost back-to-back in March 2018. The impacts of these extreme storms can include damaged property and infrastructure, business disruptions and economic damages, and displaced residents. We want to hear from you about these hazards. What climate hazard are you most concerned about, and how have you been impacted by these events, whether it's a recent nor'easter or flooding in your neighborhood? Tell us by taking that online survey. I'm going to move into the strengths and vulnerabilities section, and these were identified during the stakeholder workshop that we talked about earlier. Here are some strengths and vulnerabilities listed in the workshop specific to infrastructure, and you'll see that many features were identified as both a strength and a vulnerability. In some cases, that might be because they're essential to the town's everyday services and operations, and if they were impacted by an extreme event, or if they're already stressed by climate hazards, they would become a vulnerability. I'll highlight a few examples on this slide. Municipal buildings were seen as a strength, including police, fire, DPW, and Groton Center. The center also has a list of vulnerable residents and a list of locals who can help elderly residents with snow removal. On the strengths and vulnerability side, Groton has a strong water supply, but there was some concern about future contamination. Additionally, some residents rely on private wells, which could be impacted by future droughts. There was also concern about undersized culverts, including culverts near Route 119. There might be opportunities to improve the resilience of the Groton Electric Light Department and the communication system in the event of an emergency. There are 2 high-hazard town-owned dams. And on the vulnerability side, participants talked about roads that flood, including Broadmeadow Road, West Main Street at the Nashua River, and Route 119. For environmental vulnerabilities and strengths, wetlands were seen as a strength. They provide habitat and water storage, and the town's wetlands bylaw is forward-thinking. For both strengths and vulnerabilities, forested land was seen as a fire risk, but forests also help sequester carbon and create habitat. Agriculture is part of the town's historic heritage, but faces financial and environmental challenges. And Groton has the second largest trail network in Massachusetts, but recent rescue operations have highlighted the need for improved signage and education, particularly related to visitors who might be hiking during poor weather events. There are 2 rivers in town that are scenic destinations, but the Nashua River also has invasive water chestnut plants. And those invasive species were seen as a vulnerability, including the emerald ash borer and black swallow wort. Similarly, there was concern about vector-borne diseases, including those transmitted by ticks and mosquitoes. Some of the vulnerabilities and strengths related to societal features included residents who might be more isolated than others. Those vulnerable residents could include the elderly, children, those with limited English proficiency, and disabled residents. Workshop participants saw public transit as a strength, including the Council on Aging van and the nearby commuter rail connection. On the strength and vulnerability side, participants discussed healthcare facilities, including Seven Hills Pediatric Center, and assisted living facilities, including River Court Residences Senior Living Community. We also talked about private boarding schools, including Lawrence Academy and the Groton School, and public schools. The high school is a shelter, and the middle school has been used as a warming center. Boarding schools and student populations will require emergency services support during an extreme hazard. And we discussed commercial and industrial centers, including West Groton, Town Center, and Four Corners Village. West Groton, in particular, has few access points, so thinking about roads that might be at risk during a hazard event will be critical. Another topic that we discussed was the possibility of future climate migration, which would increase demand on local services, but also provide new residents and volunteers in a town that values its sense of community. Vulnerabilities included elderly residents, which represent roughly 14% of Groton's population and may need access to additional support and services in the event of an emergency. We also discussed the Lost Lake neighborhood, which relies on private wells and has high density that increases fire risk. Groton is a right-to-farm community, but that historic identity is at risk, and residents may be less likely to evacuate or use a public shelter during an emergency if they cannot bring their pets. We'd love to hear from you about these strengths and vulnerabilities, so please share your thoughts online. The Town of Groton is already doing a lot related to hazard mitigation, and some of those actions are listed here. The town already has a stormwater management and wetlands protection bylaw, conducts catch basin cleaning, street sweeping, snow removal, and tree maintenance. The town is also involved in public outreach and education, including sharing public information on stormwater and presenting in schools as part of the Student Awareness of Fire Education, or SAFE program. There are also examples of regional collaboration, including the Water Department's Memoranda of Understanding with surrounding water suppliers for operational assistance, and participation in the Massachusetts WARN network. Now, I'll move into some of the highest high priority action items that were identified during the stakeholder workshop. The full list of action items will be included in the final report, so I'm just going to give you an overview of the action items that rose to the top of this list during this process. There was a real focus on preparing for flooding through improving drainage and upgrading roads and culverts. There was an interest in increasing water storage and water conservation, discussion about increasing low-impact development, which nature-based strategies are ideal candidates for an MVP action grant, and there was interest in increasing habitat for endangered species and addressing invasive species. There was also interest in addressing bridges that are vulnerable to extreme events, improving the resilience of electric utilities by exploring alternative energy sources, considering underground systems, or providing incentives for energy reduction during peak demand, perhaps during a heat wave. And we talked about assessing options for dam removal and increasing public education on that topic, increasing education related to the wastewater system, and improving cell coverage for communications during an emergency. In terms of high priorities for society and environmental features, There was interest in implementing Complete Streets priorities, addressing open space through considering controlled burns and educating residents on the risks of vector-borne diseases, continuing to protect and restore wetlands, developing a fire prevention and management plan for forested land, treating stormwater, and educating homeowners on fire safety. This webinar gave an overview of the MVP planning process that we've completed so far, but we want to hear from you. Please take the online survey to tell us more about hazards and preparedness in Groton and to help us understand your priorities. That survey will be available until April 23rd, and we will incorporate your comments into our final deliverable. Thank you again for taking the time to participate in this process.